The early morning mist hung heavy over London as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood before her bedroom window at Kensington Palace. The city below seemed unusually quiet, as if the entire metropolis was holding its breath. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, watching the first rays of sunlight struggle through the gray clouds that had settled over the capital like a shroud. Behind her, William moved quietly about their private chambers, his movements deliberate but heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. Neither had slept well in the 3 days since the news had broken. How could they? The nation they had sworn to serve was reeling from an unimaginable tragedy that had shaken the very foundations of British society. The terrorist attack at the Children's Hospital in Manchester had claimed 47 lives, including 31 children under the age of 12. The numbers alone were devastating, but it was the stories behind those numbers that had left the entire country paralyzed with grief. Little Emma Thompson, age 6, who had been visiting her baby brother in the neonatal unit. The Patel twins, Arjun and Anaya, both 8 years old, who had been receiving treatment for childhood cancer. Dr. Sarah Williams, the pediatric surgeon who had thrown herself over 3 children in a desperate attempt to shield them from the blast. Catherine turned from the window as William approached, his face etched with the same mixture of sorrow and determination that had become familiar to them both over the past 72 hours. In his hands, he held 2 cups of tea, steam rising from them like whispered prayers. "The cars will be here in 30 minutes, he said softly, offering her one of the cups. His voice carried the weight of someone who had not just lost sleep, but who had spent hours on phone calls with government officials, security personnel, and grief counselors trying to understand how they could possibly provide comfort in the face of such overwhelming loss. Catherine accepted the tea gratefully, wrapping her fingers around the warm porcelain. "Have you spoken to your father this morning?" she asked, referring to King Charles, who had been equally devastated by the attack, and had spent the previous day in emergency meetings with the Prime Minister and security chiefs. "Briefly," William replied, settling into the armchair beside her. "He's as heartbroken as we are. He wanted to come with us today, but the security concerns." William's voice trailed off. They all understood. The attack had not just been an act of violence. It had been a direct assault on everything the royal family represented: stability, continuity, hope for the future. The perpetrators, a cell of domestic terrorists who had somehow evaded detection by MI5, had chosen the Children's Hospital specifically because of its symbolic value. In a manifesto released online moments before the attack, they had declared their intention to destroy the future of a nation that has forgotten its children. The cruel irony was not lost on anyone. They had destroyed the very future they claimed to be protecting. Catherine set down her tea and moved to the wardrobe where her black mourning dress hung ready. It was a simple design, elegant but understated, chosen specifically to avoid any suggestion of grandeur in the face of such profound loss. As she ran her fingers along the fabric, she thought about the countless mothers and fathers who were, at this very moment, selecting clothes for funerals they had never imagined they would have to attend. "Do you remember what your grandmother used to say about duty?" Catherine asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. William looked up from his own preparations. "That it's not about what we want to do, but what must be done," he replied, reciting the words that Queen Elizabeth II had spoken to him countless times throughout his childhood and young adulthood. "She never faced anything like this," Catherine continued, her voice growing stronger. "Not in peacetime, not with children." William stood and moved to stand behind his wife, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. Through the mirror of her dressing table, they looked at each other, 2 people who had never asked for the weight of a nation's grief to rest upon their shoulders, but who understood that it was theirs to bear nonetheless. "No," he agreed, "but she would have done exactly what we're about to do. She would have shown up. She would have listened. She would have reminded people that even in the darkest moments, we don't stand alone." The sound of vehicles arriving in the courtyard below interrupted their quiet moment. Catherine moved to the window again and saw the familiar black cars of the royal motorcade, flanked by armed police officers whose presence served as a stark reminder of the new reality they all faced. The Britain they were driving to comfort was not the same Britain they had woken up to 4 days ago. As they made their final preparations, Catherine's mind wandered to the briefing documents she had read the night before. Each page had contained a story that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The Johnson family, who had lost their only child, 7-year-old Michael, and were now facing the impossible task of rebuilding their lives around an empty bedroom and used school uniforms. The Rahman family, refugees from Afghanistan who had brought their daughter Fatima to the hospital for a routine checkup, only to lose her in an act of violence that eerily echoed the very terror they had fled. But perhaps the most heartbreaking story was that of the Henderson family. Both parents, David and Michelle, had been killed in the blast while visiting their premature son, James, in the neonatal intensive care unit. Baby James, now an orphan at just 3 months old, had become a symbol of both the tragedy's devastating impact and the community's determination to rebuild and care for its most vulnerable members. William emerged from his dressing room, adjusting his black tie one final time. Like Catherine, he had chosen his attire carefully, formal enough to show proper respect, but not so formal as to seem disconnected from the people he was going to meet. His suit was dark navy rather than black, a subtle acknowledgement that while he shared in the nation's mourning, he was there as a source of strength rather than simply another griever. The Prime Minister called again, William said, checking his phone one last time before placing it on the side table. The emergency session of Parliament has been extended. They're discussing the new security measures. Catherine nodded. She had read about the proposed legislation: increased surveillance powers, enhanced security at public buildings, mandatory background checks for anyone working with children. It was necessary, perhaps, but it represented a fundamental shift in British society. The openness and accessibility that had long been hallmarks of British institutions were being sacrificed on the altar of security. And the memorial service? She asked. Westminster Abbey, next Tuesday. The Archbishop is personally overseeing the arrangements. William paused, his expression darkening. They estimate that over 2 million people will want to attend or watch from the streets. 2 million people, all united in grief, all looking for some way to make sense of the senseless. Catherine had attended state funerals before, had stood beside William as they paid their respects to national figures and foreign dignitaries. But this was different. This wasn't about honoring a life well lived. This was about trying to heal wounds that felt too deep to ever properly mend. The soft knock at their bedroom door indicated that it was time to go. Catherine picked up her handbag, checking one final time that she had the handwritten notes she had prepared. Unlike the usual speeches written by palace staff, these were her own words, simple, heartfelt expressions of sympathy that she hoped might provide even a small measure of comfort to families facing unimaginable loss. As they walked through the corridors of Kensington Palace, their footsteps echoing off the walls lined with portraits of previous generations of royals, Catherine couldn't help but wonder what advice those long-dead monarchs might have offered. Had any of them faced a crisis that threatened not just the stability of the crown, but the very soul of the nation they served? The palace staff they passed, housekeepers, secretaries, security personnel, all offered respectful nods and murmured greetings, but Catherine could see the same mixture of sadness and uncertainty in their eyes that she had been seeing everywhere for the past 3 days. The attack had shattered more than just one building in Manchester. It had shattered the sense of security that had allowed British families to send their children to school, take them to hospitals, and trust that they would come home safely. Outside, the morning air was crisp and carried the faint scent of rain that seemed perpetually present in the London sky these days. As William helped Catherine into the back seat of their car, she caught sight of the flowers that had been left at the palace gates. Even at this early hour, there were fresh bouquets, teddy bears, and handwritten messages from people who needed somewhere to direct their grief. One message, written in a child's careful handwriting, caught her eye. Dear Prince William and Princess Kate, please tell the angels in heaven that we miss them. It was signed by Emma, age 7, and below was a drawing of what appeared to be children with wings playing in clouds. As their motorcade pulled away from Kensington Palace and began the journey north to Manchester, Catherine settled back in her seat and tried to prepare herself mentally for what lay ahead. They would visit the hospital site first, where a makeshift memorial had sprouted from the rubble like flowers growing through concrete. Then they would meet with families of the victims, each encounter requiring them to find new reserves of strength and compassion. But perhaps most challenging would be their visit to the children's ward at the neighboring hospital, where young survivors of the attack were still receiving treatment. How do you comfort a child who has seen such horror? How do you restore faith in safety and security to someone so young that they shouldn't even know such concepts could be threatened? The countryside rolled past their windows as they drove north, and Catherine found herself thinking about her own children. George, Charlotte, and Louis were safe at school, surrounded by security that had been dramatically increased since the attack. But their safety was a privilege not shared by every family in Britain, and that knowledge sat like a stone in her chest. William reached over and took her hand, squeezing it gently. They had been married long enough that words weren't always necessary. He understood the weight she was carrying, just as she understood his. Together, they were about to walk into the epicenter of their nation's grief and try to offer hope where none seemed to exist. The first sign that they were approaching Manchester came in the form of increased police presence along the roadside. Officers stood at regular intervals, their presence both reassuring and sobering. As they drew closer to the city center, the evidence of the attack's impact became more visible. Flags flew at half-mast on every building, shop windows displayed memorial messages, and black ribbons seemed to adorn every lamppost and fence. Their first stop would be the hospital site itself, where they would lay wreaths and observe a moment of silence with local officials and religious leaders. But Catherine knew that the real work would begin after the cameras stopped rolling, in the quiet conversations with families, in the gentle words offered to children who had lost friends, in the simple act of bearing witness to pain that words could never adequately express. As their car turned the final corner and the hospital site came into view, Catherine saw the crowd that had gathered despite the early hour and the light rain that had begun to fall. Hundreds of people stood in quiet groups, many holding flowers or photographs. Some were families of victims. Others were simply citizens who felt compelled to be present for this moment. The destroyed wing of the hospital had been cleared of debris, but the concrete barriers and police tape that surrounded it served as stark reminders of the violence that had occurred there. Where once there had been a children's playroom filled with laughter and the specialized wards where sick children had been cared for by dedicated medical staff, there was now only empty space and the lingering presence of lives cut short. William squeezed her hand one more time as their car came to a stop. "Ready?" he asked softly. Catherine took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and nodded. "Ready," she replied. As they stepped out of the car and into the cool Manchester morning, the crowd fell silent. The only sounds were the gentle patter of rain on umbrellas and the distant hum of traffic from the main road. Catherine and William stood for a moment at the edge of the memorial area, taking in the overwhelming display of public grief. Flowers piled 10 feet high, photographs of smiling children, handwritten messages in dozens of languages from people around the world who had been touched by the tragedy. This was just the beginning. Over the next several hours, they would meet with families, visit survivors, and try to find words that might provide comfort in the face of incomprehensible loss. They would carry the weight of a nation's grief on their shoulders and somehow find the strength to bear it with grace and dignity. The rain continued to fall gently as they walked toward the memorial site, each step taking them deeper into the heart of their country's darkest hour. Armed with nothing but their presence, their compassion, and their unwavering commitment to serve even when service demanded more than they ever thought they could give. The Manchester Children's Hospital memorial site stretched before them like a sea of color against the gray morning sky. Catherine had seen many floral tributes during her years as a royal, but nothing had prepared her for the sheer scope of this display of public grief. Thousands upon thousands of bouquets, teddy bears, balloons, and handwritten messages created a tapestry of love and loss that seemed to extend for acres around the hospital's damaged perimeter. As William and Catherine approached the temporary wooden platform that had been constructed for the ceremonial wreath-laying, they were joined by Manchester's Lord Mayor, the Chief Constable, and representatives from every major faith community in the city. The diversity of those gathered reflected the victims themselves, children, and families from every background, every faith, every walk of life that made up modern Britain. The silence was profound. Even the hundreds of onlookers who had gathered behind the security barriers seemed to understand that this moment called for reverence rather than the usual excitement that accompanied royal visits. Catherine could feel the weight of thousands of eyes upon them, not seeking entertainment or spectacle, but looking for some sign that their pain was recognized, that their children's lives had mattered. Archbishop Michael Thompson stepped forward to offer a brief prayer, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, despite the gentle rainfall that continued to fall. "We gather not just to mourn," he said, his words carefully chosen, "but to remember that love is stronger than hatred, that community is more powerful than terror, and that the light of these young lives continues to shine even in our darkest hour." As the Archbishop spoke, Catherine's eyes were drawn to a section of the memorial that had been specifically designated for children's messages. Colorful drawings were protected by plastic sheeting, showing rainbows, flowers, and smiling stick figures with angel wings. One drawing, clearly made by very young hands, showed a simple house with the words "Come home soon" written in crayon underneath. It was heartbreaking in its innocent failure to understand the finality of death. When it came time for them to lay their wreath, William and Catherine moved forward together. The wreath itself was simple but significant. White roses for innocence, blue delphiniums representing the big, open heart, and baby's breath to symbolize everlasting love. The card attached bore only simple words, "In loving memory of young lives taken too soon. You will never be forgotten, William and Catherine." As they placed the wreath and stepped back for a moment of silence, Catherine found herself thinking about each of the 47 people who had died. She had memorized their names, their ages, their stories. It seemed the least she could do to ensure that they were more than just numbers, more than just statistics and newspaper headlines. There was Amelia Roberts, age 4, who had been at the hospital for a routine hearing test and had been described by her nursery teacher as sunshine in human form. Marcus Williams, age 9, who had been receiving treatment for juvenile diabetes and whose ambition had been to become a doctor so he could help other children like himself. Dr. Janet Morrison, age 56, a pediatric nurse with 30 years of experience who had spent her final moments evacuating children from the blast zone. The moment of silence stretched on, filled with the soft sound of rain and the distant murmur of prayers being whispered in multiple languages. When it finally ended, William and Catherine were approached by several family representatives who had been specially invited to meet with them. The first family they encountered was the Andersons, Margaret and David, whose 8-year-old daughter Sophie had been killed while waiting for a cardiac consultation. Margaret's eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion and grief, but she managed a trembling smile as Catherine took her hands. "Your Royal Highness," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain. "Thank you for coming. Sophie would have been so excited to meet you. She had pictures of you and Prince William on her bedroom wall." Catherine felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Please, call me Catherine," she said gently. "And tell me about Sophie. What did she love to do?" For the next few minutes, Margaret and David shared stories about their daughter, how she loved to dance, how she was learning to play the violin, how she had announced just the week before the attack that she wanted to be a princess when she grew up, so she could help people like Princess Kate does. Each memory was precious and painful, a window into a life that had been full of promise and joy. As they spoke, Catherine noticed David's hand shaking. The trauma of losing a child was compounded by the violent and senseless nature of her death. These parents would not only have to cope with grief, but with the knowledge that their daughter had died in terror and confusion in a place where she should have been safe. Sophie's funeral is tomorrow, Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke about her daughter. We're having it at St. Mary's, where she was baptized. The whole school is coming. Her teacher said she's never seen children so determined to say goodbye properly. William, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. Would it be appropriate for us to send flowers? Or perhaps make a small donation to a charity in Sophie's memory? David nodded gratefully. She loved animals. There's a local dog rescue that she always wanted to volunteer with when she was old enough. These conversations, Catherine reflected, were why they were really here. Not for the cameras or the headlines, but for these moments of human connection in the midst of unimaginable pain. Each family they met had a different story, but they all shared the same need to have their child's life acknowledged, to know that their loss mattered to someone beyond their immediate circle. Their next encounter was with the Rahman family, refugees from Afghanistan whose daughter Fatima had been killed at age 6. Mr. Rahman spoke limited English, but his wife Farah spoke fluently, having worked as a translator before fleeing the Taliban. We came here for safety, Farah said, her voice steady but filled with profound sadness. We thought we had left the bombs and the killing behind. Fatima was so excited to be starting school, to be learning English properly. She said she wanted to be a teacher like her grandmother had been in Kabul. The cruel irony of the Rahman family situation was not lost on Catherine. They had fled one form of terrorism only to have it follow them to what should have been their sanctuary. The attack had not just killed their daughter. It had shattered their faith in the possibility of finding true safety anywhere. Fatima loved butterflies, Farah continued, reaching in her handbag to pull out a small photograph of a smiling little girl with dark curls and bright eyes. Every time we walked to the park, she would chase them. She said they were freedom dancing. The phrase freedom dancing hit Catherine with particular force. This child, who had experienced displacement and uncertainty in her short life, had found joy in something as simple and beautiful as butterflies in flight. Now that joy was gone, extinguished by the same kind of hatred her family had crossed continents to escape. As they moved through the memorial site, stopping to speak with more families and local officials, Catherine became aware of a group of children who had been watching from a distance. They were students from local schools, holding handmade signs with messages of remembrance and hope. One sign, held by a girl who couldn't have been more than 7 years old, read, "We will remember them always." William noticed the children at the same time and, after conferring briefly with security, approached their group. The children straightened up with excitement and nervousness, clearly awed by the presence of the future king and his wife. "Hello," William said warmly, crouching down to their level. "Thank you for coming today. These signs are beautiful." A boy with sandy hair and freckles stepped forward, clearly having been elected spokesman by the group. "Your Royal Highness, we're from Maple Primary School. We wanted to do something for the children who died, but we didn't know what. Our teacher said the most important thing was to remember them." Catherine knelt down beside William, heedless of the damp ground. "That's exactly right," she said gently. "Remembering them, talking about them, keeping their stories alive. That's one of the most important things we can do." "What else did your teacher tell you?" A little girl with pigtails raised her hand as if she was in class. She said that when people do bad things, we have to respond with good things. And that love is stronger than hate, even when it doesn't feel like it. The wisdom of children, Catherine thought, could sometimes cut straight to the heart of complex adult problems. These young people, many of whom were the same age as some of the victims, understood something fundamental that sometimes eluded their elders, that the response to hatred must be love, that the answer to violence must be community. Would you like to add your signs to the memorial? William asked. I think it would be wonderful for people to see what you've created. The children nodded eagerly and, with their teacher's permission, carried their signs to a designated area where children's contributions were being displayed. Watching them carefully place their handmade tributes among the thousands of other offerings, Catherine felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. Their next scheduled stop was inside the neighboring hospital, where several of the attack survivors were still receiving treatment. This was perhaps the most challenging part of their visit, meeting with children who had witnessed unimaginable trauma and were now trying to heal both physically and emotionally. The Royal Manchester Children's Hospital had opened its doors to accommodate the overflow of patients after the attack. The pediatric ward had been transformed into a place of intensive care and careful therapy, where medical staff worked alongside child psychologists to help young minds process what they had experienced. Before entering the ward, William and Catherine met with Dr. Sarah Chun, the hospital's chief of pediatric medicine, who briefed them on what they could expect. We have 12 children from the attack still with us, Dr. Chun explained as they walked through the hospital corridors. Their physical injuries range from minor to severe, but the psychological trauma is universal. Some are talking about what happened. Others haven't spoken at all since they arrived. A few are asking for their parents or friends who didn't survive. The weight of that last statement settled heavily on Catherine's shoulders. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that their best friend is never coming to play again? How do you help a child understand why the safe place they went to for help became a place of terror? Their first patient visit was with Emma Whitfield, age 8, who had suffered a broken leg and cuts from flying glass, but had been remarkably lucky given her proximity to the blast. Emma was sitting up in bed, coloring in a book when they entered her room. Her parents, who had been maintaining a constant vigil at her bedside, stood nervously as William and Catherine approached. "Hello, Emma," Catherine said softly, taking a seat in the chair beside the bed. "I'm Catherine, and this is William. We heard you were very brave during the scary time at the other hospital." Emma looked up from her coloring book, studying Catherine's face with the serious consideration that children often brought to important moments. "Are you really a princess?" she asked finally. "I am," Catherine replied with a gentle smile. "But, more importantly, I'm a mom, just like your mom. And when children are hurt or scared, moms want to help make things better." This seemed to satisfy Emma, who returned to her coloring but continued the conversation. "The loud noise was really scary," she said matter-of-factly, "and there was a lot of blood. But Dr. Martinez helped me, and now my leg doesn't hurt so much." The simplicity with which Emma described her trauma was both heartbreaking and remarkable. Children, Catherine knew, possessed a resilience that adults often underestimated, but that resilience came with its own complications. Emma might recover physically, but the psychological scars of what she had witnessed would likely remain with her for years to come. "What are you coloring?" William asked, leaning in to look at Emma's artwork. "Butterflies," Emma replied, showing them a page filled with colorful winged creatures. "My friend Fatima liked butterflies. She's not here anymore because she went to heaven, but I'm coloring them for her." The mention of Fatima Rahman, the Afghan refugee child they had met earlier with her family, created a connection that made Catherine's chest tighten with emotion. Here it was a survivor honoring a victim in the simple, beautiful way that children understood best. "That's very thoughtful of you," Catherine managed, her voice slightly thick. "I think Fatima would love these butterflies." As they continued their visits through the pediatric ward, similar scenes played out. Children dealing with trauma in ways that were both heartbreaking and inspiring. 10-year-old James Morrison, who hadn't spoken since the attack, but who carefully listened to every word spoken to him. 7-year-old Aisha Patel, who kept asking if the bad men were going to come to this hospital too. 9-year-old Michael O'Connor, who had appointed himself the unofficial protector of the younger children on the ward. Each interaction required Catherine and William to find new reserves of strength and compassion. They had to be hopeful without being dismissive of the children's fears honest without being overwhelming, comforting without making promises they couldn't keep. The final visit of their hospital tour was with twins Lucy and Sarah Davidson, age 6, who were sharing a room after both had been injured in the blast. They had been at the hospital with their baby brother, who had survived the attack unharmed but was now staying with relatives while his sisters recovered. The twins were nearly identical, but their responses to the trauma had been completely different. Lucy was chatty and engaged, eager to show off her get-well cards and stuffed animals. Sarah had barely spoken since the attack and clung to a ragged teddy bear that she refused to let anyone else touch. Sarah's bear is very special, their mother, Helen Davidson, explained quietly. It belonged to her friend Emma Thompson, who didn't make it. One of the nurses found it in the rubble and brought it here. Sarah won't go anywhere without it now. Catherine felt her breath catch. Emma Thompson, the 6-year-old who had been visiting her baby brother in the neonatal unit. The teddy bear that Sarah now clutched was likely the last thing her friend had touched before the world exploded around them. Sitting carefully on the edge of Sarah's bed, Catherine spoke gently to the little girl. "That's a very special bear," she said. "I can see that it's important to you. Would you like to tell me about your friend Emma?" For a moment, it seemed as though Sarah might not respond. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Emma was my best friend. We were going to have a sleepover next week." It was the first time Sarah had spoken about Emma since the attack, according to her parents. The simple statement, "We were going to have a sleepover next week," contained all the lost futures, all the interrupted friendships, all the ordinary childhood joy that had been destroyed in those terrible moments. "That sounds like it would have been wonderful," Catherine replied, her voice carefully controlled. "What kinds of things did you and Emma like to do together?" Over the next few minutes, Sarah slowly began to share memories of her friendship with Emma. They liked to play dress-up. They both loved chocolate ice cream. They were learning to ride bikes together. Each memory was precious, not just for what it revealed about Emma, but for what it showed about Sarah's own healing process. As their hospital visit came to an end, Catherine and William took a few moments to speak with the medical staff who had been caring for these children around the clock. The doctors, nurses, and therapists had not just been treating physical injuries. They had been serving as surrogate parents, counselors, and sources of stability for children whose worlds had been turned upside down. "How do you do it?" Catherine asked Dr. Chun as they walked back toward the hospital's main entrance. "How do you maintain hope when you're dealing with such trauma every day?" Dr. Chun paused thoughtfully before answering. "The children teach us," she said finally, "their capacity for resilience, for finding joy even in the midst of pain. It reminds us why this work matters. Every small breakthrough, every moment when a child smiles or laughs or reaches out for comfort is a victory against the people who try to destroy their innocence." As William and Catherine left the hospital and prepared for their final stop of the day, a meeting with emergency responders and hospital staff who had been first on the scene, Catherine reflected on what they had witnessed. The attack had been intended to break the spirit of a community, to sow fear and division. But what she had seen instead was love in action. Families caring for each other, strangers offering comfort to those in pain, children honoring their lost friends in the simple, beautiful ways they knew best. The rain had stopped by the time they stepped outside, and weak sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds. It seemed fitting, somehow, a small sign of hope after hours of confronting the deepest kind of darkness. There was still so much work to be done, so many families to comfort, so many questions about security and safety and how to prevent such tragedies in the future. But for now, there was this, the knowledge that even in the face of unimaginable evil, the human capacity for love and connection remained unbroken. The children they had met would carry scars, both visible and invisible, for the rest of their lives. But they would also carry something else, the memory of adults who had refused to let them face their trauma alone, who had shown up in their darkest hour not with easy answers, but with presence, with compassion, with the simple but profound message that their lives mattered. As they walked toward their waiting car, Catherine caught sight of a rainbow beginning to form in the distant sky. She thought about Emma's coloring book, about Fatima's butterfly dancing, about Sarah's precious teddy bear, and about all the ways that love persists even when everything seems broken. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new meetings with grieving families, new questions about how to move forward. But today had reminded her why such work was not just important, but sacred. The drive back to London felt different from their journey north that morning. The weight of what they had witnessed in Manchester sat heavily between William and Catherine as their motorcade moved through the changing landscape of the English countryside. The meetings with families, the visits with surviving children, the overwhelming display of public grief, it all seemed to have fundamentally altered something within them. Catherine stared out the window at the rolling hills and small villages they passed, each containing families who were undoubtedly glued to their television screens, following coverage of the attack and its aftermath. She wondered how many parents had held their children a little tighter tonight, how many had struggled to explain why such terrible things could happen in a world they were supposed to be keeping safe. The memorial service planning meeting is at 8 tomorrow morning, Williams said quietly, breaking the contemplative silence that had settled over them. His voice carried a weight that hadn't been there that morning, the accumulated impact of hours spent in direct contact with grief. Catherine nodded, pulling her attention back from the window. The National Memorial Service at Westminster Abbey would be one of the largest gatherings in recent British history. Representatives from every Commonwealth nation had requested to attend, along with leaders from across Europe and beyond. But, perhaps more significantly, it was estimated that nearly 2 million ordinary citizens would line the streets of London, all seeking some way to participate in the collective mourning of their nation. "Have they finalized the guest list?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would be complicated. "How do you decide who gets to attend a service for 47 victims when millions want to participate?" "The immediate families, of course," William replied. "Beyond that, it's been challenging. Representatives from every school the children attended, the medical staff who were on duty that day, the first responders. The Archbishop is suggesting we reserve a significant portion of the Abbey for ordinary citizens, people selected by lottery from those who request to attend." It was a democratic approach to what could easily become an elitist affair, Catherine reflected. In a tragedy that had affected working-class families, immigrant families, and middle-class families with equal brutality, it seemed important that the memorial service reflect that same diversity. "And the families' wishes?" she asked. "How are they feeling about such a large public service?" William's expression grew even more serious. "Mixed feelings, as you might expect. Some are grateful for the national attention, feeling like it honors their children's memories. Others are overwhelmed by the scale of it all. They're dealing with private grief and, suddenly, finding themselves at the center of a national moment." Catherine understood. During their visits that day, she had sensed the complex emotions that came with being thrust into the spotlight during the worst moment of one's life. There was gratitude for the support and attention, but also a desire for privacy and space to grieve without the weight of public expectations. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and she glanced down to see it was from her private secretary. 300 interview requests received today. BBC, ITV, CNN, international networks, all requesting exclusive access. "How would you like me to respond?" Catherine showed the message to William, who shook his head wearily. "We'll do one interview," he said. "Something thoughtful, not sensationalized. Perhaps with David Dimbleby or someone similar. The focus needs to be on the families and the community, not on us." As their car approached the outskirts of London, they could see evidence of how the attack had affected the capital as well. Flags flew at half-mast from government buildings, black ribbons adorned lampposts, and impromptu memorial sites had appeared in parks and squares throughout the city. The terrorist attack in Manchester had become a national tragedy, one that had touched every corner of British society. Catherine's thoughts turned to their own children, who were waiting for them back at Kensington Palace. George, Charlotte, and Louis had been kept informed of events in age-appropriate ways, but she knew they would have questions. How do you explain to a child that there are people in the world who want to hurt other children? How do you maintain their sense of security while being honest about the realities they would inevitably face? We should talk to the children tonight, she said to William. Together. They need to understand why we've been away, why everyone is so sad, and what our role is in helping people through this. William nodded. George especially has been asking questions. His protection officer said he's been worried about whether his school is safe, whether we're safe. He's old enough to understand more than we sometimes give him credit for. The responsibility of parenting royal children during a national crisis carried unique challenges. Their children would grow up to serve the British people, but they were also children who deserved to feel safe and protected. Balancing their need for security with their future need to understand and connect with public suffering was a delicate task. As they entered London proper, Catherine noticed the increased security presence throughout the city. Armed police were visible at transport hubs, government buildings, and major tourist attractions. The openness that had characterized British society was being necessarily curtailed in response to the attack, and she wondered what long-term effects this would have on the national character. The Prime Minister wants to brief us tomorrow afternoon, William continued, scrolling through messages on his phone. New security protocols, changes to public event planning, increased intelligence sharing with European partners. Everything is going to be different now. Different. It was a word that had been echoing in Catherine's mind all day. The Britain they had woken up to 4 days ago was gone, replaced by something more guarded, more suspicious, more afraid. The attack had succeeded in that sense. It had fundamentally altered the social fabric of the country, introducing fear into spaces that had once felt unconditionally safe. But something else had emerged from the tragedy as well, something the perpetrators probably hadn't anticipated. The response from ordinary citizens had been extraordinary. Donations pouring in for victims' families, volunteers offering support, communities coming together across religious and cultural lines to reject the hatred that had motivated the attack. Did you see the fundraising numbers? Catherine asked, remembering a briefing document she had read that morning. Over £12 million in 4 days. William replied with something that might have been amazement. From people all over the world, but especially from ordinary British families. Small donations, mostly £5 here, £10 there. People giving what they can. £12 million. It was a staggering sum, made even more impressive by the fact that it represented hundreds of thousands of individual decisions to help, to give, to participate in the healing process. Each donation was a small act of defiance against the forces that had sought to divide and terrorize. Their motorcade turned onto the familiar streets leading to Kensington Palace, and Catherine felt a complex mixture of relief and guilt at returning to safety and comfort while the families they had met that day faced sleepless nights and uncertain futures. The contrast between their privilege and the suffering they had witnessed was sharp and uncomfortable. Tomorrow we need to start thinking about long-term support, she said as they approached the palace gates. The memorial service is important, but what happens after that? When the cameras go away and the politicians move on to other issues, those families will still be dealing with their loss. William turned to look at her, and she could see that he had been thinking along similar lines. A foundation, perhaps. Something focused specifically on supporting families affected by terrorism and on community healing programs. It was an idea with merit, Catherine thought. They had the platform, the connections, and the resources to create something lasting and meaningful. But it would need to be done carefully with significant input from the communities affected to ensure it was truly helpful rather than merely well-intentioned. As they pulled through the palace gates, Catherine could see lights on in the windows of their private apartments, where their children were presumably finishing homework or preparing for bed. The normalcy of it felt almost surreal after the day they had experienced. The palace staff who greeted them at the door were subdued, offering quiet condolences and updates on the children's day. Even within the protected walls of Kensington Palace, the impact of the attack was being felt. Security protocols had been enhanced, travel plans were being reviewed, and everyone was grappling with new realities about safety and vulnerability. "Your Royal Highnesses," said their private secretary, Maria Santos, as they entered the main hall. "The children are waiting for you in the family sitting room. They've been asking about your trip all day, and they've been watching the news coverage with their governess." Catherine felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach. What had her children seen on television? How much of the horror and grief had filtered through despite efforts to shield them? At ages 10, 8, and 5, they were old enough to understand that something terrible had happened, but young enough to be frightened and confused by images and reports they might not fully comprehend. "We'll go up immediately," William said. "Has there been any change to their schedule for tomorrow?" "The school has implemented additional security measures," Maria replied. "Nothing that should affect their day significantly, but there will be additional staff present, and some outdoor activities have been moved indoors as a precautionary measure." Even their children's education was being affected by the attack. Catherine wondered how teachers across the country were handling classroom discussions about current events, how they were helping children process images and information that no child should have to encounter. As they walked up the stairs toward their private apartments, William took Catherine's hand. They were about to transition from their public roles as representatives of the Crown to their private roles as parents, and both responsibilities felt equally weighty at that moment. "Mummy, Daddy," Charlotte's voice carried down the hallway as she ran toward them, followed more sedately by George and Louis. The simple joy in their daughter's voice was like a balm after the day's accumulated sorrow, a reminder of innocence and happiness that still existed in the world. Catherine knelt down to embrace Charlotte, breathing in the familiar scent of her daughter's shampoo and feeling some of the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. Louis attached himself to William's leg with characteristic enthusiasm, while George approached more cautiously, his 10-year-old awareness of adult emotions making him sensitive to the sadness his parents carried. "How was your trip?" George asked, his voice careful and mature beyond his years. "It was important," William replied, lifting Louis while keeping one arm around George. "We met some families who were very sad because they lost people they love. And we met some children who were hurt but are getting better." "Were they hurt by the bad men on the news?" Charlotte asked, her 8-year-old directness cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Catherine and William exchanged glances. They had agreed on age-appropriate honesty, but finding the right words in the moment was challenging. "Yes," Catherine said gently, settling into the comfortable sofa in their family sitting room. "Some very confused and angry people did something terrible at a children's hospital in Manchester. People were hurt, and some people died. That's why everyone is so sad, and why Daddy and I went to visit and try to help." Louis, at 5, was less interested in the specifics than in the reassurance that his parents were home safely. But George and Charlotte absorbed this information with the seriousness it deserved. "Could it happen here?" George asked. "Could bad people come to our school or our house?" It was the question Catherine had been dreading, because there was no entirely honest answer that wouldn't be frightening. The truth was that terrorism could strike anywhere, that no place was absolutely safe. But these were children who needed to feel secure enough to sleep peacefully and engage with the world around them. "There are lots of people whose job it is to keep us all safe," William explained. "Police officers, security people, intelligence officers. They work very hard to prevent bad things from happening. And we have extra protection because of our jobs." "But the children in Manchester had protection too," George said, demonstrating the logical thinking that sometimes made conversations with intelligent children particularly challenging. "You're right," Catherine acknowledged. "Sometimes bad things happen, even when people are trying to prevent them. But that doesn't mean we should be afraid all the time. Most people in the world are good people who want to help each other, not hurt each other." Over the next hour, they continued the conversation, allowing each child to ask questions and express their concerns. Charlotte wanted to know if they could send a drawing to the children in the hospital. Lewis asked if the bad men were in jail now. George, with characteristic thoughtfulness, asked whether their royal responsibilities meant they would have to go to more sad places where people were hurt. It was George's question that stayed with Catherine long after the children had been tucked into bed. The answer was yes. This would not be the last time they would be called upon to represent the nation in times of crisis and grief. Their roles as senior royals meant they would repeatedly find themselves at the intersection of public service and private emotion, required to be sources of strength and comfort even when they were struggling with their own feelings. Later that evening, as she and William sat in their private study reviewing briefing documents for the next day's activities, Catherine found herself thinking about the long-term implications of what they had experienced. The memorial service would be emotionally draining but finite. The real challenge would come in the weeks and months that followed, as the acute phase of national mourning gave way to the longer, more complex process of healing and moving forward. "The Archbishop called while we were upstairs," William said, looking up from a speech draft he had been reviewing. "He wanted our input on the memorial service music selections. Apparently, there's been some disagreement among the families about whether to include traditional hymns or more contemporary pieces. It was exactly the kind of delicate issue that seemed to arise whenever personal grief intersected with public ceremony. Each family had their own traditions, their own preferences, their own way of honoring their lost loved one. Creating a service that felt meaningful and inclusive for everyone would require careful navigation of competing desires and expectations." "What did you tell him?" Catherine asked. "That we should defer to the family's wishes above all else," William replied. "But also that perhaps there's room for both traditional elements that connect us to our shared heritage and contemporary elements that speak to the diverse communities affected by this tragedy." Catherine nodded, appreciating the diplomatic wisdom in that approach. The memorial service needed to serve multiple functions: honoring the victims, comforting the families, allowing the nation to grieve collectively, and somehow pointing toward healing and hope for the future. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed it was her mother, Carol Middleton, calling from Berkshire. "Darling," her mother's voice was warm but concerned. "I've been watching the coverage all day. How are you holding up?" The question, coming from someone who knew her not as a public figure, but as a daughter, nearly undid Catherine's carefully maintained composure. Suddenly, she was not the Princess of Wales bearing the nation's grief with dignity, but simply a woman who had spent the day confronting unimaginable suffering and was struggling to process it all. "It's been difficult, Mum," she admitted, her voice slightly unsteady. "The families, the children in the hospital, I can't stop thinking about what they're going through." "Of course you can't," Carol replied gently. "You wouldn't be human if you could. But remember that you can't carry all of this yourself. You did what you could today, and you'll do what you can tomorrow. That's all anyone can ask." After ending the call, Catherine sat quietly for a moment, appreciating the grounding effect of her mother's practical wisdom. Tomorrow would indeed bring new challenges: the memorial service planning, meetings with government officials, more interviews with families, and the ongoing work of trying to understand how to prevent such tragedies in the future. But tonight, she and William were home safely with their children. Tonight, they could hold each other and begin the process of emotionally digesting what they had witnessed. Tonight, they could prepare themselves for the days and weeks of service that lay ahead, knowing that their role in the nation's healing process was just beginning. As she finally prepared for bed, Catherine looked out the window at the lights of London stretching to the horizon. Somewhere out there, families were grieving losses they would never fully recover from. Somewhere out there, children were having nightmares about terrible things they had witnessed. Somewhere out there, emergency workers and medical staff were continuing their vigil, caring for survivors and working to prevent future tragedies. But somewhere out there, people were also choosing hope over fear, love over hatred, community over isolation. Tomorrow's memorial service would be a formal expression of those choices, a public declaration that terrorism might wound a nation but could not destroy its fundamental character. Catherine turned away from the window and toward the work that awaited them, carrying with her the faces and voices of all the people they had met that day, the grieving parents, the surviving children, the dedicated medical staff, the ordinary citizens who had lined the streets not out of curiosity, but out of love. They all deserved leaders who would honor their pain and channel it towards something meaningful and lasting. The real test of their service would not be in the grand gestures and public ceremonies, but in the quiet consistency of their commitment to the families and communities affected by this tragedy, long after the world's attention had moved on to other crises. The morning of the memorial service dawned gray and still, as if London itself was holding its breath in preparation for the day ahead. From her bedroom window at Kensington Palace, Catherine could see the early preparations already underway. Security barriers being positioned, camera crews setting up their equipment, and the first groups of mourners beginning to gather along the route to Westminster Abbey despite the early hour. She had barely slept, her mind unable to quiet the accumulation of images and voices from the past week. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the families they had met in Manchester. Margaret and David Anderson grieving for their daughter Sophie. The Ramon family struggling to understand how they had fled violence only to have it follow them to Britain. Little Sarah Davidson clutching her friend Emma's teddy bear like a lifeline to a world that no longer made sense. William was already awake, standing at his dressing room mirror as he adjusted his ceremonial uniform. The dark navy fabric was adorned with medals and decorations that marked his military service and royal duties, but today they felt less like honors and more like the weight of responsibility he carried as future king. His movements were precise and practiced, but Catherine could see the tension in his shoulders, the slight tremor in his hands as he fastened his collar. "The weather forecast says no rain until this afternoon," he said without turning around, his voice carefully neutral in the way it became when he was managing his own emotions. "Small mercies." Catherine nodded, though he couldn't see her. The logistics of the memorial service had been staggering. Accommodating 2 million people in central London, coordinating security for dozens of world leaders, managing the emotional needs of 47 grieving families while creating a ceremony that would serve the broader need for national healing. Rain would have made an already complex situation even more challenging. Their own children had left for school that morning with extra security and strict instructions to call if they felt overwhelmed by anything they might see or hear about the day's events. George, at 10, had asked if he would be old enough to attend such ceremonies himself someday. The question had stopped Catherine cold, forcing her to confront the reality that her children would indeed inherit not just privilege and position, but also the obligation to bear witness to their nation's darkest moments. A soft knock at the bedroom door interrupted her thoughts. Their private secretary, Maria Santos, entered with the morning briefings and a final schedule review. "Your Royal Highnesses," Maria said quietly, her usual professional demeanor touched with something softer today. "The families have begun arriving at Westminster Abbey. The Prime Minister and Archbishop Thompson are ready for the final protocol review at 9:30, and the international delegations have all confirmed their attendance." Catherine accepted the briefing papers, noting the careful detail that had gone into every aspect of the day. Seating arrangements that balanced protocol with family wishes. Musical selections that honored both traditional British heritage and the diverse communities affected by the attack. A procession route that would allow maximum public participation while maintaining security requirements. "How are the families doing?" William asked, finally turning from his preparations. Maria's expression grew even more serious. "Mixed, as you might expect. Some are grateful for the national recognition of their children's lives. Others are overwhelmed by the scale of attention." Mrs. Anderson asked specifically if she could speak with you before the service begins. She's concerned about whether she'll be able to maintain her composure during the readings. Margaret Anderson, Sophie's mother. Catherine remembered her trembling hands and red-rimmed eyes, her desperate need to talk about her daughter's love of dancing and dreams of becoming a princess. The thought of this grieving mother worrying about her public composure was heartbreaking. "Of course," Catherine replied immediately. "We should arrive early anyway. There will be time." As they made their final preparations, Catherine found herself thinking about the broader significance of what was about to unfold. Memorial services for national tragedies had become an unfortunate feature of modern life. Oklahoma City, September 11th, the London bombings of 2005. Each event had forced communities to grapple with questions about how to honor victims, how to comfort survivors, and how to move forward without forgetting. But there was something different about this tragedy, something that had touched the British psyche in a particularly deep way. Perhaps it was the deliberate targeting of children, the violation of a space that should have been devoted to healing and hope. Perhaps it was the way the attack had cut across all the social and cultural lines that might normally divide communities. Victims from every background, every faith, every economic circumstance. Or perhaps it was the timing, coming at a moment when British society was already grappling with questions about identity, security, and what it meant to be a multicultural democracy in an increasingly complex world. The attack had forced these abstract political debates to become painfully personal for hundreds of families and thousands of community members. Their motorcade left Kensington Palace precisely on schedule, escorted by armed police through streets that had been cleared of normal traffic, but were lined with people standing in respectful silence. Catherine had attended many royal processions over the years, had grown accustomed to crowds waving and calling out greetings. Today was different. The people they passed stood quietly, many holding flowers or photographs, all bearing witness to a moment of collective grief. As they approached Westminster Abbey, the scale of the gathering became apparent. The ancient church was surrounded by barriers and security checkpoints, but beyond these practical necessities, the scene was one of remarkable dignity and order. Thousands of people had arranged themselves along the processional route, creating what looked like a river of humanity flowing toward the Gothic spires of the abbey. "Look," William said softly, pointing toward a group of school children who were holding hand-painted signs with messages of remembrance. "They're from Manchester. Some of them must have traveled down just for today." The sight of children honoring children created a lump in Catherine's throat. These young people, many the same age as the victims, had felt compelled to be present for this moment of national mourning. Their presence was both heartbreaking and hopeful, evidence that the next generation understood something fundamental about community and compassion. Inside Westminster Abbey, the atmosphere was hushed and heavy with anticipation. The great space, which had hosted coronations and royal weddings, state funerals, and celebrations of national triumph, was today transformed into something more intimate despite its grand scale. 47 photographs of the victims were displayed prominently near the altar, each face a reminder of the individual lives that had been lost in the statistics of tragedy. Catherine and William were immediately approached by Archbishop Thompson, whose usual serene demeanor was marked by the weight of the responsibility he carried today. "Your Royal Highnesses," he said quietly, "thank you for arriving early. The families are in the chapter house, and Mrs. Anderson has indeed requested a few moments with you both." They followed the Archbishop through the Abbey's ancient corridors to the chapter house, where the families of the victims had been gathering away from the public eye. The scene that greeted them was one of profound sadness mixed with remarkable dignity. Parents, siblings, grandparents, and extended family members were dressed in their finest clothes, preparing to say farewell to their loved ones in the most public possible way. Margaret Anderson approached them almost immediately, her composure more steady than it had been in Manchester, but still fragile. She was accompanied by her husband David and, to Catherine's surprise, by Sophie's 8-year-old brother Michael. "Your Royal Highnesses," Margaret said, her voice carefully controlled. "Thank you for speaking with us. I wanted to ask, during the service, when they read Sophie's name. Should I stand? I don't want to do anything inappropriate, but I also want to honor her properly. The question revealed so much about the impossible position these families found themselves in, thrust into a national ceremony while dealing with the most personal kind of loss, desperate to honor their children appropriately while navigating unfamiliar protocol and overwhelming emotion. Mrs. Anderson, Catherine said gently, taking the woman's hands in her own, there is no wrong way to honor Sophie today. If standing feels right to you, then stand. If sitting feels better, then sit. Today is about remembering your daughter and all the children who were taken from us. Everything else is secondary. Young Michael Anderson had been listening to this conversation with the serious attention that children often brought to adult discussions they sensed were important. Suddenly, he tugged on Catherine's dress to get her attention. "Princess Catherine," he said in the clear voice of childhood, "will Sophie know that all these people came for her? Will she know how many people loved her?" The question, asked with such innocent directness, nearly shattered Catherine's carefully maintained composure. How do you explain death and memorial and the meaning of public grief to a child who has lost his sister? How do you offer comfort that is both honest and hopeful? "I think she will," Catherine replied, kneeling down to Michael's eye level. When so many people come together to remember someone, when they tell stories about how special that person was, I think that love travels. Sophie knows how much you love her, and I think she knows how much all these other people want to honor her memory. Michael seemed to consider this answer carefully before nodding with satisfaction. His acceptance of this explanation reminded Catherine of something she had been struggling to articulate all week. That children often possessed a clarity about love and loss that adults complicated with questions about fairness and meaning and how to prevent future tragedies. As they continued to move through the chapter house, meeting with other families and offering what comfort they could, Catherine was struck by the diversity of the group. The Ramon family, still struggling with the cruel irony of losing their daughter to the very violence they had fled. The O'Connor family from Dublin, who had been visiting relatives in Manchester when the attack occurred. The Williams family, 3 generations of Jamaican immigrants who had seen their grandson's dreams of becoming a doctor destroyed in an instant. Each family had their own story, their own way of coping with loss, their own needs for how their child should be remembered. So I wanted to talk about their children's personalities and dreams. Others prefer to focus on practical matters, the funeral arrangements, the establishment of memorial funds, the long-term care of siblings who had survived the attack, but bore psychological scars. What united them all was a kind of determined grace, a refusal to let their children's deaths be defined solely by the hatred that it caused them. They spoke about establishing scholarships, funding playground equipment, supporting other families affected by terrorism. Even in their darkest hour, they were choosing to channel their grief towards something constructive. As the time for the service approached, Catherine and William took their seats in the front section of the abbey, positioned so they could see both the altar where the ceremony would unfold and the families who were the true focus of this gathering. Around them, the abbey was filling with an extraordinary assembly of people, world leaders and ordinary citizens, celebrities and emergency workers, politicians and teachers, all united by a shared need to bear witness to this moment of national mourning. The service began with a procession that included representatives from every faith community in Britain, a deliberate acknowledgement that the victims had come from many different religious and cultural backgrounds. As they walked slowly down the abbey's long aisle, Catherine found herself thinking about the many different ways people understood death and grief, remembrance, and hope. When Archbishop Thompson began the opening prayer, his words seemed to capture something essential about what they were all trying to accomplish. We gather not to understand the incomprehensible, but to affirm that love is stronger than hatred, that community is more powerful than division, and that the light of these precious lives continues to shine even in our darkest hour. The readings that followed have been chosen carefully to reflect both the Christian heritage of the Abbey and the diverse beliefs of the families affected. a passage from the Psalms about walking through the valley of the shadow of death, a selection from the Quran about the innocence of children, a poem by Maya Angelou about the resilience of the human spirit. Each text offered a different lens through which to understand loss and hope, grief, and healing. But it was the personal tributes that truly captured the emotional heart of the service. When Sophie Anderson's teacher spoke about her students' love of learning and determination to help others, Margaret Anderson did indeed stand, tears streaming down her face, but her posture straight and proud. When Dr. Sarah Williams' colleague described the pediatric surgeon's final act of heroism in trying to shield children from the blast, the entire Abbey rose as one in recognition of such courage. Perhaps the most powerful moment came when 12-year-old James Morrison, a surviving patient from the hospital, walked slowly to the podium with the help of crutches and spoke about his friend Emma Thompson. His voice was small in the vast space of the Abbey, but every word carried clearly. Emma always said she wanted to be a doctor when she grew up, so she could help sick children feel better. She said being in the hospital was scary, but it was also where miracles happened. I think Emma was right about miracles because even though she's not here anymore, all of you came today to remember her and all our friends. That feels like a miracle to me. As young James made his way slowly back to his seat, Catherine noticed something remarkable happening throughout the Abbey. People were reaching out to touch each other, holding hands, placing comforting arms around shoulders, offering tissues, and whispered words of support. The formal structure of the memorial service was being transformed by countless small acts of human connection. The service concluded with a moment that would stay with Catherine for the rest of her life. As the final hymn began, 47 white balloons were released from the Abbey's highest windows, each one representing one of the victims. As they rose toward the Gothic ceiling and disappeared through specially opened panels into the gray London sky, the entire congregation sang together. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. The choice of that particular hymn had been deliberate. It was a song about redemption, about finding light in darkness, about the possibility of transformation even in the face of profound loss. As 2,000 voices joined together in singing those familiar words, Catherine felt something shift in the atmosphere of the Abbey, a movement from grief towards something that might, eventually, become hope. As the service ended and the formal processions began, Catherine and William found themselves once again with the families of the victims. But something had changed during the ceremony. The weight of public attention had somehow become lighter, transformed into a kind of support that lifted rather than burdened. "Thank you," Margaret Anderson said simply as they prepared to leave the Abbey. Sophie would have loved all the singing. And knowing that so many people will remember her name, that means everything to us. Outside Westminster Abbey, the crowds that had gathered to participate in the memorial service were dispersing slowly, reluctantly, as if people were unwilling to let go of the collective experience they had shared. Catherine and William walked among them for a few minutes, accepting flowers and condolences, listening to stories and expressions of support. One elderly woman, leaning heavily on a walking stick, approached Catherine with tears in her eyes. "I lost my grandson in the Blitz," she said in a voice that carried the weight of decades. Different war, different enemy, but the same kind of evil. What I learned then was that the only way to defeat such evil is to refuse to let it make us afraid to love each other. As they finally returned to their car for the drive back to Kensington Palace, Catherine reflected on the wisdom of that elderly woman's words. The memorial service had been about many things: honoring victims, comforting families, allowing a nation to grieve collectively. But perhaps most importantly, it had been an act of defiance against the forces that sought to divide and terrorize. The attackers had wanted to create fear, suspicion, hatred between communities. Instead, they had created one of the most powerful demonstrations of unity and compassion in recent British history. Muslims and Christians, immigrants and native-born citizens, young and old, rich and poor, All had come together to declare that love was indeed stronger than hatred. That evening, as Catherine and William sat with their own children and helped them process what they had witnessed on television, she found herself thinking about the long view of history. Today's memorial service would be remembered, but more importantly, the children in the Abbey and watching around the world would carry forward the lesson it had taught about how communities respond to crisis. George, Charlotte, and Louis would grow up in a world where such tragedies were possible, but they would also grow up with the knowledge that when the worst happened, people could choose to respond with their best selves. That might be the most important legacy of this terrible week. Not just the memory of lives lost, but the example of how a nation could mourn together and somehow find its way toward healing. The work of supporting the affected families and communities would continue for months and years to come. There would be foundations to establish, policies to review, security measures to implement. But today had reminded everyone involved that the most important response to terror was not just better security or enhanced surveillance, but the simple, powerful act of refusing to let hatred have the last word. As Catherine finally prepared for bed that night, she looked once more out her window at the lights of London. The city looked the same as it had a week ago, but she knew it was fundamentally changed. They all were. The attack had taken 47 lives and wounded many more, but it had also revealed something profound about the capacity of ordinary people to choose love over fear, community over isolation, hope over despair. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new opportunities to serve. But tonight, Catherine fell asleep knowing that when her nation had faced its darkest hour, it had found its way towards something that looked improbably like grace.